Judge Carter, I assure you, we take these matters seriously. Then prove it, David shot back. This needs to be public. There needs to be consequences. Williams hesitated, clearly torn between protocol and pressure. The officer's eyes darted between them, her face paling slightly. David let the silence stretch, then spoke again, his voice unwavering. I won't let this be another case that gets swept under the rug, Captain. Either you do what's right, or I will make sure the whole world knows what happened here tonight. Williams met his gaze. The tension in the air was suffocating. And then, finally, the captain nodded. Let's talk, he said. David's stance remained firm as Captain Williams exhaled deeply, glancing at the officer beside him. Her confidence had faded, replaced by unease. She shifted her weight, her hands twitching at her sides as if resisting the urge to speak. This situation never should have happened. Williams admitted, his voice quieter now, but everyone could hear him. Judge Carter, I understand why you're upset, and I promise you, we will conduct a full investigation. David narrowed his eyes. And what does that mean exactly? The crowd hushed. Everyone was waiting for the answer. Williams cleared his throat. It means Officer Reynolds will be placed on administrative leave while we review the body cam footage and determine the appropriate actions. David scoffed. Administrative leave? Paid leave? Williams hesitated before nodding. For now, yes. A murmur of disapproval rippled through the crowd. Someone muttered, "Of course, always the same." David inhaled slowly, steadying himself. That's not enough. His voice was controlled but firm. You want to investigate? Fine, but I want full transparency. I want this department to acknowledge what happened here tonight, publicly. Williams' eyes flickered with hesitation. Judge, these matters are delicate. No, they're not, David interrupted. They're only delicate when people want to protect the guilty. The officer's head snapped up, her lips pressing into a thin line. She looked as if she wanted to defend herself, but David wasn't interested in excuses. Williams sighed. What are you asking for? David's gaze didn't waver. A press conference. The department needs to address racial profiling publicly, and I want to meet with the mayor and the police chief to discuss real changes. Williams hesitated, his jaw tightening. The weight of the demand was clear. Then, finally, he nodded. I'll set it up. David nodded back, but he knew this was just the beginning. David studied Captain Williams carefully, searching his face for any sign of hesitation. He had heard empty promises before, seen men in power nod along, only to let the issue fade away once the cameras were gone. But this time, he wasn't letting that happen. Set it up, David repeated, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. Williams shifted uncomfortably but nodded. I'll speak with that, unbuckled his seatbelt. Slowly, deliberately, he pushed open the door and stepped onto the pavement. The officer took a step back, her hand still hovering near her gun. We've had reports of stolen vehicles in the area, she said. This Audi matches the description. David's jaw tightened. This wasn't about a stolen car. This was about him. David stood beside his car, his hands relaxed at his sides, though his muscles were taut with tension. The officer eyed him like a suspect, her expression hard, her stance unwavering. This is my vehicle, David said, his voice steady. I purchased it last week. If you run the plates, you'll see everything is in order. The officer didn't move. She didn't reach for her radio, didn't even glance at his registration. Instead, she took a step closer. Hands on the hood, she ordered. David exhaled slowly, trying to suppress the frustration rising in his chest. Is this really necessary? Do as you're told, she snapped. Now. His jaw clenched. He had spent years fighting for justice, ensuring fairness in the courtroom. Yet here he was, being treated like a criminal for no reason other than suspicion. He glanced around. More curtains shifted. A few neighbors stepped onto their porches, their faces unreadable. Some looked concerned, others merely curious. Humiliation burned through him, but he forced himself to remain composed. He knew how these situations could spiral out of control. Slowly, he turned and placed his hands flat on the smooth, cool hood of his car. Rough hands patted him down, searching for weapons he didn't have, looking for reasons that didn't exist. This vehicle was reported stolen last week, the officer muttered as she continued her search. I already told you, David said, his voice tight with controlled anger. This car belongs to me. The paperwork is in your hands. If you just... Quiet, she interrupted. David took another deep breath. This wasn't just about a car. This was about power, and she was abusing it. David remained still, his hands pressed against the hood of his car. His pulse pounded in his ears, but he refused to let his anger take control. He had been in too many courtrooms, seen too many cases where things spiraled out of control because emotions ran high. He knew better. The officer's hands were rough and impersonal as she frisked him, patting down his pockets, checking for weapons he didn't have. Each touch sent a wave of indignation through him, but he kept his composure. "This car matches the description of a stolen vehicle," she repeated, as if trying to justify her actions. David lifted his head slightly. "Then run the plates," he said evenly. "Check the registration you're holding. Everything is in my name." The officer didn't respond. Instead, she took a step back, hands still hovering near her gun. The silence between them was thick, charged with unspoken words. David turned slowly, meeting her gaze. "Officer," he said, his voice firm but measured. "I know my rights. I also know when I'm being profiled." Her eyes narrowed. "Are you resisting?" A bitter chuckle escaped David's lips. "I haven't moved. I haven't raised my voice. Yet you're treating me like a threat." The tension between them crackled like static electricity. From the corner of his eye, David saw a man step onto his porch across the street. It was Mr. Dawson, his elderly neighbor. The old man had a concerned look on his face, his phone in hand. Others were watching too, their silent gazes pressing into the scene. David exhaled, shaking his head. "I've spent my life upholding the law," he said, "but right now it's failing me." The officer's expression flickered, just for a moment. Doubt, hesitation. But would it be enough? The street felt unnaturally silent, despite the hum of the police cruiser's engine and the occasional rustle of leaves. David could feel the weight of every glance from the homes around him. His neighbors, some he had spoken to just days ago, now stood frozen in doorways watching. The officer remained rigid, her hand still resting on her holster. Her hesitation was brief, too brief. Whatever flicker of doubt she'd felt was gone now, replaced by the same rigid authority she had displayed from the start. "You fit the description," she stated flatly. David let out a slow breath. "Description?" he repeated. "Of what? A car thief? A criminal?" Her jaw tightened, but she didn't answer. "Did the report say the suspect was a black man?" he pressed, his voice calm but edged with steel. She didn't respond, and that was answer enough. David's fingers curled slightly against the hood of his car. He was no stranger to bias. He had faced it in law school, in the courtroom, even at formal events where people mistook him for anything but a judge. But this was different. This wasn't a misunderstanding at a gala or an ignorant comment at a networking event. This was the law itself, the very institution he had dedicated his life to, treating him as guilty until proven innocent. The silence stretched until another voice cut through it. "Is there a problem here?" David turned to see Mr. Dawson standing at the edge of his yard, his phone raised slightly. The officer stiffened. David met Mr. Dawson's gaze, reading the silent message in his eyes. Someone was watching. Someone was recording. Maybe, just maybe, that would change the outcome. The presence of Mr. Dawson shifted the dynamic instantly. The officer's posture remained rigid, but David could see the flicker of unease in her eyes. She wasn't just dealing with a suspect anymore. She was being watched. David took a slow step away from the hood of his car, standing tall. He knew he had to tread carefully, but he also refused to let himself be diminished. "Sir," Mr. Dawson said, addressing David directly. "Do you need any help?" David gave a slight nod of acknowledgement. "I appreciate your concern, Mr. Dawson," he said, keeping his voice steady. "I believe the officer here was just about to verify my registration and let me go." The officer's jaw clenched, her fingers twitching near her holster. She glanced at Mr. Dawson, then back at David, as if recalculating her approach. "I need to complete my check," she said, her voice losing some of its former sharpness. "Then do it," David replied, folding his arms. "Because so far, you've only harassed and humiliated me in my own neighborhood without cause." More neighbors were stepping outside now. A woman across the street was holding up her phone, filming. A man near his car had his arms crossed, his expression one of disapproval. The pressure was mounting. The officer hesitated, then finally lifted her radio. "Dispatch, I need a plate check on." She rattled off the numbers from David's registration. David could hear the faint response crackling through the radio. He already knew what they would say. The car was his. He wasn't a suspect. The officer's face remained unreadable, but David caught the way her shoulders stiffened. Now the real test began. Would she admit her mistake, or would she try to regain control of the situation at any cost? A tense silence filled the air as the officer listened to the response from dispatch. David watched her closely, noting the slight shift in her stance. The radio confirmed what he had told her from the start. His car wasn't stolen. He wasn't a suspect, yet she didn't immediately step back. Instead, she exhaled sharply, gripping her belt. "Well," she muttered, "there's been some confusion." David narrowed his eyes. Confusion? His voice was calm, but each syllable carried a weight that could not be ignored. The growing audience, his neighbors, their phones recording, waited for her next move. The officer seemed to realize she was losing control of the situation, and for the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed her face. David took a measured step forward. "What exactly was confusing, officer?" he asked. "The fact that a black man was driving an expensive car, or the fact that I didn't immediately bow to your authority?" Her lips parted, but no words came. Mr. Dawson took a step closer. "You should apologize to the man," he said, his voice steady. The officer stiffened. "I was just doing my job," she said defensively. David let out a slow breath, shaking his head. "No," he said. "Your job is to uphold the law, not to abuse your power. What you did here tonight was racial profiling." More murmurs spread through the small crowd forming. The weight of public scrutiny pressed down on her, and for the first time she looked truly uncomfortable. David held her gaze, unflinching. "So, officer," he said, his voice low but firm, "are you going to do the right thing, or are you going to pretend this never happened?" The officer's face reddened slightly. The power in this moment had shifted. David was no longer just a man being questioned. He was a man demanding accountability. The officer's breath hitched slightly, her grip tightening on her belt. She had been in control moments ago, issuing orders, demanding compliance, but now, with eyes on her and cameras recording, the power was slipping from her grasp. David stood firm, unwavering. The tension between them thickened as the weight of accountability loomed over her. "Sir, I was following procedure," she said finally, her voice clipped, but noticeably less aggressive. David scoffed lightly. "Procedure?" He tilted his head. "Is racial profiling part of your department's standard operating procedure?" The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. Someone chuckled dryly. Another person muttered, "Yeah, let's hear this one." The officer's face flushed deeper. She glanced at the growing audience, clearly realizing this wasn't something she could simply walk away from. "I received a report about a stolen vehicle," she said, but even she seemed uncertain of her words now. David crossed his arms. "And did the report specifically mention my car, my license plate, my exact make and model?" The officer hesitated. "Or did it just mention a nice car with a suspicious driver?" he pressed. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. David exhaled sharply. "You didn't stop me because my car was stolen," he said. "You stopped me because you didn't think I belonged here." A heavy silence followed. The officer's jaw clenched, but her eyes darted toward the approaching figure of Captain Williams. David saw it too, and he knew. This was far from over. This was about to reach a whole new level. The sound of Captain Williams' polished boots against the pavement cut through the thick silence. The officer stiffened, stepping back instinctively as her superior approached. David turned to face him, arms crossed over his chest. He had known Williams for years, had seen him testify in court, had even spoken with him at community events. But tonight, none of that mattered. Tonight, Williams was here as the face of the system that had just humiliated him. "Judge Carter," Captain Williams said, his voice measured but urgent, "I apologize for this misunderstanding." There was that word again, misunderstanding. David's jaw clenched. "A misunderstanding?" he repeated, his voice low but sharp. "Is that what we're calling this?" Williams sighed, briefly glancing at the officer. "I was informed about the situation a few minutes ago. We'll be reviewing this incident internally." "No," David interrupted. "This doesn't get buried in an internal review." The crowd murmured in agreement. Someone from the back shouted, "Hold her accountable." The officer visibly swallowed, shifting on her feet. David took a step closer to Williams, lowering his voice but making sure every word carried weight. Do you know how many times I've seen cases like this play out? A black man gets humiliated, the officer gets a slap on the wrist, and nothing changes. Williams exhaled through his nose, rubbing his temple. Judge Carter, I assure you, we take these matters seriously. Then prove it, David shot back. This needs to be public. There needs to be consequences. Williams hesitated, clearly torn between protocol and pressure. The officer's eyes darted between them, her face paling slightly. David let the silence stretch, then spoke again, his voice unwavering. I won't let this be another case that gets swept under the rug, Captain. Either you do what's right, or I will make sure the whole world knows what happened here tonight. Williams met his gaze. The tension in the air was suffocating. And then, finally, the captain nodded. Let's talk, he said. David's stance remained firm as Captain Williams exhaled deeply, glancing at the officer beside him. Her confidence had faded, replaced by unease. She shifted her weight, her hands twitching at her sides as if resisting the urge to speak. This situation never should have happened. Williams admitted, his voice quieter now, but everyone could hear him. Judge Carter, I understand why you're upset, and I promise you, we will conduct a full investigation. David narrowed his eyes. And what does that mean exactly? The crowd hushed. Everyone was waiting for the answer. Williams cleared his throat. It means Officer Reynolds will be placed on administrative leave while we review the body cam footage and determine the appropriate actions. David scoffed. Administrative leave? Paid leave? Williams hesitated before nodding. For now, yes. A murmur of disapproval rippled through the crowd. Someone muttered, Of course, always the same. David inhaled slowly, steadying himself. That's not enough. His voice was controlled but firm. You want to investigate? Fine, but I want full transparency. I want this department to acknowledge what happened here tonight, publicly. Williams' eyes flickered with hesitation. Judge, these matters are delicate. No, they're not, David interrupted. They're only delicate when people want to protect the guilty. The officer's head snapped up, her lips pressing into a thin line. She looked as if she wanted to defend herself, but David wasn't interested in excuses. Williams sighed. What are you asking for? David's gaze didn't waver. A press conference. The department needs to address racial profiling publicly, and I want to meet with the mayor and the police chief to discuss real changes. Williams hesitated, his jaw tightening. The weight of the demand was clear. Then, finally, he nodded. I'll set it up. David nodded back, but he knew this was just the beginning. David studied Captain Williams carefully, searching his face for any sign of hesitation. He had heard empty promises before, seen men in power nod along, only to let the issue fade away once the cameras were gone. But this time, he wasn't letting that happen. Set it up, David repeated, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. Williams shifted uncomfortably but nodded. I'll speak with the chief and the mayor first thing in the morning. The crowd murmured, some skeptical, others hopeful. One voice called out, and if nothing changes? David turned toward them, his presence commanding. Then we make sure they hear us louder, he said, his voice steady. We don't let this die in a press conference. We hold them accountable every step of the way. Williams ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. Judge Carter, I understand how serious this is, but these things take time. David's expression hardened. They've had time. A beat of silence passed between them. The officer, still standing nearby, shifted her weight. The weight of her actions was settling in, but David didn't spare her a glance. She wasn't his concern anymore. The system that allowed her behavior was. Williams finally broke the silence. We'll do it, publicly. David gave a firm nod. Then I'll be there. With that, he turned back toward his car. He wasn't done fighting, not even close. But tonight, he had forced a system to listen. Now, he had to make sure it changed. By the time David got home, his phone was buzzing nonstop. News of the incident had already begun to spread. Neighbors who had witnessed the confrontation had recorded everything. The flashing police lights, the pat-down, the moment he demanded justice, all of it was now circulating online. Angela was waiting for him at the door, her arms crossed, concern etched into every line of her face. David, she breathed, relief washing over her. Are you okay? He stepped inside, sighing as he loosened his tie. I'm fine, but it happened again. His jaw clenched. The neighbors called me. They sent me the video. David nodded. Good. The more people see, the harder it'll be for them to sweep this under the rug. She followed him into the kitchen where he poured himself a glass of water. And now, she asked, what's next? David took a slow sip, his mind already racing. A press conference. Williams agreed to make it public, but that's not enough. Angela sat across from him. You know how these things go. They'll apologize, suspend the officer for a while, and then move on like nothing happened. Not this time, David said firmly. I'm going to make sure they do more than just apologize. Angela reached for his hand, squeezing it. Then you won't be doing it alone. David gave her a tired but grateful smile. No, I won't. Just then, his phone vibrated again. A message from an unknown number popped up. Judge Carter, we need to talk. I have information you'll want to hear. Call me. David stared at the screen. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. David stared at the message on his phone, his mind racing. Who was this? What kind of information did they have? And why did they want to talk to him? Angela noticed his expression. What is it? He showed her the message. She frowned. Do you recognize the number? David shook his head. No. But whoever this is, they knew how to reach me. Angela hesitated. It could be a trap. Or it could be exactly what we need, David countered. He took a deep breath and dialed the number. The line rang twice before a voice answered. Judge Carter? Yes. Who is this? A pause. Then in a hushed tone the person spoke. I work at the precinct. I can't say much over the phone, but you need to know, this wasn't just a mistake. The officer who stopped you, Reynolds, she's been involved in incidents like this before, multiple times. David's grip on the phone tightened. And nothing was done? A bitter chuckle came through the line. They always cover for her. They say there's no solid evidence, that it's all misunderstandings. But I've seen the complaints. I've seen the footage they don't release. David exchanged a glance with Angela, his pulse quickening. Can you prove it? A pause. Then, meet me tomorrow. I'll show you everything. David exhaled slowly. Where? I'll text you the location, but come alone. The line went dead. Angela grabbed his hand. David, this is dangerous. He nodded. I know. But if what they're saying is true, we're about to expose something much bigger than one bad cop. The next morning, David drove to the meeting location, a quiet, abandoned parking lot on the outskirts of town. He parked his car and scanned the area. It was early, and the streets were empty. The tension in his chest tightened. Was this a setup? A moment later, a hooded figure emerged from a nearby alleyway, glancing around nervously before approaching his car. David rolled down his window just enough to speak. Are you the one who messaged me? The person nodded quickly and pulled out a flash drive. Everything you need is on here, they said in a hushed voice. Internal reports, complaints, even body cam footage they buried. David's heartbeat quickened. And you're sure this is real? The figure scoffed. I wouldn't be risking my job, and maybe my life, if it wasn't. They shoved the flash drive into his hand. They're going to try and silence you. Be careful. Before David could ask another question, the person turned and disappeared down the alleyway. David sat still for a moment, gripping the flash drive. His legal mind raced. If the files were real, they could expose a culture of corruption within the department. This wasn't just about one bad cop anymore. It was about an entire system protecting its own. He put the car in gear and drove home, his hands tight on the wheel. Angela was waiting for him when he arrived. Did you get it? She asked. David held up the flash drive. If this is what they say it is, we finally have proof. Angela's eyes widened. Then we don't wait, we go public. David nodded. We go public, and we make sure everyone sees this. That evening, David sat at his desk, betrothed, staring at the flash drive. His hands trembled slightly as he plugged it into his laptop. Angela stood beside him, her expression tense. Are you ready for this? David exhaled. No, but we can't turn back now. He clicked open the files, and what he saw made his stomach tighten. Dozens of complaints against Officer Reynolds, racial profiling, excessive force, intimidation tactics. Some reports had been quietly dismissed. Others had been marked resolved with no explanation. Then, the body cam footage. David clicked on the first video. The screen filled with grainy night vision footage of Reynolds pulling over a black man, accusing him of stealing his own car. Another clip showed her handcuffing a teenager for looking suspicious outside a convenience store. Angela covered her mouth. My God, She's been doing this for years. David's jaw clenched, and the department let her. He reached for his phone and dialed Captain Williams. "Judge Carter," Williams answered, his voice hesitant. "What can I do for you?" "You can start by watching the email I just sent you," David said. "And then you can tell me how you're going to explain why your department has been covering for Officer Reynolds." There was a long silence. "Judge, we need to handle this internally." "No," David interrupted. "The public deserves to know the truth." He hung up and turned to Angela. "We're going to the press." Within hours, the files were leaked. News stations picked up the story. Social media exploded, and the truth spread like wildfire. The department was under fire. Protests began forming outside the precinct, and Officer Reynolds was officially placed under investigation. As David watched the headlines, Angela squeezed his hand. "You did it." David shook his head. "We did it, but this is just the beginning." This story is more than just fiction. It's a reflection of real struggles that many people face every day. Justice should never be a privilege. It should be a right for all. What do you think about David Carter's fight for justice? Have you, or someone you know, ever experienced something similar? We want to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue telling powerful stories that matter. Together, we can shine a light on injustice and demand accountability. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.